My husband took one look at the glowing pink lines, laughed a cold, ugly laugh, and said, "That parasite isn't mine." Half an hour later, I was locked out, watching my suitcases hit the freezing Chicago pavement. 3 nights of shivering in the back seat of my ancient Honda Civic later, an aggressively polite corporate attorney tracked me down. My first husband, the man I quietly walked away from a decade ago, was dead. He left me his entire maritime logistics company, valued at roughly $80 million. But there was a violently specific catch. Hello, beautiful souls. It's Celine here, broadcasting live. Drop your city in the chat. I honestly need the company tonight. People claim a dying marriage makes a sound. They tell you it's a slow tearing, obvious and loud. That's a lie. When you desperately love a man, you become totally deaf to the decay. You excuse the sudden coldness. You justify the way he stops looking at your mouth when you speak. You call it burnout. You blame the economy. I did exactly that, and it gutted me. But the universe has a twisted sense of humor. I survived the gutting, and somehow I ended up holding the knife. My name is Nora Vance, and for 5 years I was married to Julian. We owned a gorgeous, suffocating 3-story brownstone in Boston. It was the sort of neighborhood where everyone smiles with their teeth, but never their eyes, and the local committee dictates what shade of white you can paint your window trim. I worked as an archivist for a historical society. Julian brokered high-end vintage cars for rich men experiencing midlife crises. To the outside world, we were flawless. We were the couple our friends toasted at New Year's Eve parties. But a flawless surface usually means nobody is looking underneath. The first genuine crack appeared roughly a year before the implosion. Julian started taking phone calls out on the terrace in the dead of winter. I caught him one night after I got home late from the archives. Snow was falling, the house was pitch black except for the glow of his cigarette outside. I found him huddled by the wrought iron railing, whispering frantically into his phone. When I slid the glass door open, he jumped, immediately hung up, and blamed a demanding client in Tokyo. I swallowed the lie without chewing. I didn't want to taste the truth.
Then the money started bleeding out. Julian always managed our finances, a habit I surrendered to because numbers gave me a migraine, and he seemed to enjoy the control. But around the time the terrace phone calls started, the accounts grew lighter. $400 here, $600 there. Always cash, always withdrawn while I was elbow deep in dusty manuscripts at the library. When I confronted him over a glass of wine, he didn't even blink. He gave me that infuriatingly smooth smile and claimed he needed liquid cash to grease the palms of mechanics and transport drivers. "You know how this industry works, babe," he told me. I let it slide. The midnight calls didn't stop. The cash kept vanishing. And then Julian picked up a bizarre new habit. Out of nowhere, he started bringing up Arthur. Arthur Pendleton was my starter husband. We married foolishly young. I was 22, he was 30. We dissolved the marriage 3 years later. We didn't hate each other, we just realized we were holding each other back from the people we were supposed to become. He moved to Seattle to build a pharmaceutical startup, and we became strangers. I hadn't heard Arthur's voice in 11 years. So when Julian suddenly asked, "Hey, whatever happened to that pharma geek you used to be married to?" I froze. It wasn't a one-off comment. He asked 4 different times over a single summer. He masked it as casual curiosity, but it felt calculated, like a trap.
I wrote his bizarre obsession off as simple, pathetic insecurity. I figured his ego was bruising for some reason, and I planned to drag him to a marriage counselor by the end of the year to sort it out. I honestly thought we had decades left to fix our messes. Then I missed my period. I was exactly 7 weeks pregnant when the floor completely caved in. I took 3 different over-the-counter tests in the sterile, fluorescent-lit bathroom of the Historical Society before finally dragging myself to a clinic for official blood work. The terror and absolute euphoria hit me simultaneously, stealing my breath. We hadn't been actively trying for a baby, but we certainly hadn't been using anything to prevent one either. In my blind, stupid optimism, I assumed Julian and I were painting the same picture of our future. I came home that Thursday night practically vibrating with adrenaline. I had bought a tiny, ridiculous pair of knitted booties. They looked like little vintage driving shoes, a nod to his car obsession, and folded the ultrasound printout into a tiny square, hiding it inside the toe of the left shoe. I placed the box squarely on his favorite leather armchair, poured myself a glass of sparkling cider, and waited for the lock to turn. I remember every single breath, every heartbeat of what happened next. The memory is permanently burned into the back of my eyelids. Julian stared at the tiny knitted booties. He stared at the black and white sonogram. He didn't gasp. He didn't smile. Instead, he set the box down on the marble island with the slow, meticulous precision of a man defusing a bomb. Then he looked up. His eyes were completely dead. Not angry, just empty, like a shark sizing up a meal. "That parasite isn't mine," he said. The words dropped into the kitchen like lead weights. I actually let out a ridiculous, breathless laugh. I waited for the punchline. I waited for him to smirk and pull me into a hug. His expression didn't shift a millimeter. He said it again, louder this time. He claimed he knew I was sleeping with someone else. He claimed he'd been tracking my affair for half a year. When my brain finally kicked in and I reached across the island to grab his arm, he flinched backward. He actually recoiled, looking at my hand like I was covered in battery acid. He told me to get out. Not tomorrow, right that second. Before the shock could even wear off, I was standing on the sidewalk in my winter coat listening the deadbolt slide into place. By 9 o'clock, I was parked outside a Whole Foods a mile from our house, staring at the stupid booties sitting on my passenger seat.
I sat shivering in the driver's seat of my Civic. I didn't break down sobbing into the steering wheel like some tragic heroine in a cheap movie. I just left the engine running, blasting the heat, because Boston in February is vicious. The daytime sun tricks you, but the night air bites right through your clothes. Through the windshield, I watched people pushing grocery carts. A woman was arguing with a toddler about a box of organic crackers. Normal, boring, beautiful life, happening just 20 feet away, and I was entirely locked out of it. Why does a supposedly happy husband instantly declare a pregnancy fake? That question kept bouncing around my skull. He didn't ask for a paternity test. He didn't ask who the father was. He just stated it as a fact and threw me out. By midnight, my brain shifted from shock to cold, hard inventory. I had exactly $312 in my personal checking. Over the last 3 years, I'd funneled my entire savings into our joint account because Julian swore it made managing the mortgage easier. My heavy winter boots, my archive credentials, my irreplaceable hard drive of historical research, all locked inside that brownstone. My health insurance was through his brokerage firm. I was practically broke, newly pregnant, and completely untethered.
Then the realization hit me. It didn't arrive with a dramatic gasp. It just slipped into my mind, cold and sharp. Julian asking about Arthur 4 times in a single summer. Julian wasn't the jealous type. He didn't care about my past romances. What he cared about was leverage. He spent his days evaluating the depreciation of luxury assets. He only paid attention when there was a return on investment. If he was digging into my starter husband, he had found the scent of money. I grabbed my phone, my fingers stiff from the cold, and typed Arthur Pendleton's name into the search bar. I hadn't Googled him in a decade. The results loaded. 3 years ago, a massive biotech conglomerate swallowed Arthur's pharmaceutical startup. The exact buyout number was sealed, but the acquiring firm was notorious for billion-dollar acquisitions. After that, Arthur's digital footprint vanished. No new ventures, a dead LinkedIn page. He took the payout and went off the grid. I sat in the dim glow of the Whole Foods parking lot, putting the pieces together. Julian knew about the buyout. How long had he been watching Arthur's wealth? And more importantly, what did Arthur's money have to do with me? I barely slept. At 5 a.m., I gave up, threw the Civic into drive, and headed to a grimy 24-hour diner over in Southie. I ordered black coffee and toast that tasted like cardboard. Sitting in a cracked vinyl booth, watching the sky turn a bruised purple, I started building a framework. I am an archivist. I know how to reconstruct missing history from scattered documents. I could reconstruct my own life. First step, breach the brownstone. Julian couldn't legally keep me from my own passport or research drives, though I knew he'd try to play dirty. Second step, find a shark. I didn't need a mediator. I needed a lawyer who could tell me if he could legally lock me out of a house with my name on the deed. Third step, the baby. I needed blood work, an OBGYN, and a realistic look at my insurance nightmare, and I needed it yesterday. And the fourth step, the most dangerous one. I had to prove what Julian knew about Arthur's windfall. Julian's accusation of an affair wasn't a sudden rage spiral, it was an eviction notice.
Why fabricate a cheating scandal to dump your pregnant wife? Because you need her permanently off the board before a specific financial event occurs. He wanted me disqualified from whatever money he thought was coming. The pregnancy just threw a wrench in his timeline, forcing him to execute his sloppy backup plan. He panicked, and panicked men leave paper trails. I dropped a $5 bill on the sticky table and walked out into the freezing dawn. I felt strangely grounded. Not safe, not happy, but solid. When you spend your life studying old building foundations, you learn to spot which walls are bearing the weight and which are just plaster. Julian was just plaster. I pulled up my contacts and found Evelyn Reyes, a ruthless family attorney I'd met at a historical society fundraiser. I had her direct line because I'd helped her track down the original blueprints of her office building. It was barely 7:15. I didn't care. I texted her, "Evelyn, it's Nora Vance. I need an emergency consult. My marriage just exploded." My screen lit up 9 minutes later. "Cancel my 9 o'clock," she wrote. "Be here at 8:45.
Evelyn's office was downtown, occupying the penthouse of a glass monolith I usually ignored. Her paralegals scooped me up from the lobby at 8:40 and deposited me into a mahogany-paneled room that smelled strongly of espresso and expensive leather. I was a wreck. I was wearing the same wrinkled slacks from yesterday, smelling like car exhaust. My only concession to hygiene was a travel toothbrush I grabbed at a pharmacy on the drive over. I didn't care how I looked. Evelyn swept into the room right on the dot of 8:45. She dropped a leather-bound notebook on the table and studied me. She had the flat, unreadable eyes of a woman who had seen every ugly flavor of divorce and remained entirely unimpressed with human garbage. "Spill it," she said, her voice like dry gravel. "From the top. Don't leave out the embarrassing parts." I gave her the whole ugly narrative. She didn't interrupt once. She just dragged her pen across the paper. When I finally stopped talking, 20 minutes later, the silence in the room felt heavy. Evelyn capped her pen and leaned forward, folding her hands. "All right," she said. "Let's tackle the bleeding wounds first. Your name is on the deed to that brownstone, yes?" I nodded. "If your name is on the deed, changing the locks is a civil violation," Evelyn said, barely blinking. "We can hammer him for that later. Right now, look at your joint accounts. Has he drained them?" I didn't know. Evelyn nudged her tablet across the desk. "Check, now." I pulled up my banking app. The screen loaded and my stomach plummeted. $41. $41.16. Just 3 days ago, we had nearly $40,000 in there, money from the sale of my grandmother's antique collection that I'd stupidly deposited for a shared investment. I set the phone down. My fingers were strangely steady. "He cleaned it out," I whispered. Evelyn didn't flinch. She just tapped her pen. "When?" "Timestamp says between 10 and 11 last night, an hour after he threw me onto the street." "Textbook asset dissipation," Evelyn muttered, scribbling furiously. "I can get an emergency freeze on his remaining assets by noon. Now, tell me about this ex-husband." I laid out everything about Arthur, the pharmaceutical buyout, and Julian's sudden creeping obsession with him. Evelyn leaned back, steepling her fingers. "You think Julian discovered a potential windfall coming your way and initiated a preemptive strike to cut you out before it vested?" "I think he's exactly that greedy," I said.
"It's a legally coherent motive," Evelyn said, her voice flattening into pure business. "And if true, it turns this from a standard divorce into a bloodbath. When you leave here, you are going to call the state bar's referral service. Find a probate attorney in Washington state. You need to know if your first husband left a will or a trust. Furthermore, document everything. Use a burner email address he knows nothing about. Send every screenshot, every text message, every bank alert to that address." I walked out of Evelyn's penthouse office at 10:30, clutching a thick folder of intake forms. I didn't feel terrified anymore. I felt weaponized. The biting Boston wind whipped across the parking garage as I sat in my Civic, systematically executing Evelyn's orders. I took screenshots of the drained bank account and forwarded them to an old college email address Julian had never seen. Then I tracked down Arthur's sister, Clara. We hadn't spoken since the divorce, but Clara had always been decent to me. I found her on Instagram, looking older but still wearing her signature thick-rimmed glasses. I sent a direct message. "Clara, it's Nora. I'm so sorry to intrude, but I need to reach someone regarding Arthur." She called me through the app 20 minutes later. Her voice sounded completely wrecked.
"Nora," Clara said, her breath hitching. "Arthur died in October. An aneurysm. He was only 45. The parking garage spun. Arthur was dead. He'd been dead for 4 months. His legal team has been hunting for you," Clara said, her voice echoing slightly over the connection. "How did you not know?" I told her the truth, that I was living a different life, that my current marriage had just exploded. Clara stayed quiet for a long time. "He never got married again," she finally said. "He talked about you at the end, said you were the only woman who actually saw him, not his bank account. His lawyer is Marcus Thorne in Seattle. Call him, now." I hung up. The silence in the car was absolute. The geometry of my entire life suddenly clicked into a terrifying, rigid shape. The missing $40,000, the barrage of questions about Arthur, the sudden baseless accusation of an affair. Julian hadn't just suspected something, he knew. He had somehow discovered Arthur's death months ago. He spent the entire winter calculating his exit strategy, and when I walked into the house carrying a pair of baby booties, I threatened to blow up his timeline. He had to sever the marriage immediately. I wasn't discarded because I was unloved. I was discarded because I was a financial liability. I dialed Marcus Thorne's Seattle office. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped the phone between the seats. His receptionist patched me through almost instantly. "Miss Vance," Marcus said. His voice was gravelly, radiating the kind of tired relief that comes from closing a long, difficult case. "We've been trying to locate you. You are the primary beneficiary of Arthur Pendleton's estate." "How much are we talking about?" I asked, my voice sounding like it belonged to a stranger. $82 million, Marcus stated, but there is a specific stipulation attached. $82 million. I stared at a crack in the concrete wall of the parking garage, watching a spider crawl across the gray paint. My brain simply couldn't process a number that large. Marcus explained the trap door. Arthur had funneled his biotech buyout money into an ironclad blind trust. The money was mine, but to claim it, I had to physically present myself at Marcus's Seattle office within 60 days of contact to submit biometric verification and sign the transfer deeds. Arthur was intensely paranoid about corporate espionage and fraud, Marcus explained. He updated the trust 7 months before his aneurysm. He wanted to guarantee that nobody could impersonate you or claim the funds remotely. Could someone outside the family have found out about this trust? I asked, my throat tight.
Trust details are sealed, Marcus said carefully, but if someone had the capital and hired a forensic accountant, they could trace the corporate filings and infer a massive transfer of wealth. Why do you ask? I gave him the short version, the cheating accusation, the drained accounts, the midnight eviction. Marcus went completely silent. When he spoke again, his tone was lethal. Instruct your divorce counsel to barricade this inheritance. It goes into a shadow account. Your husband gets absolutely nothing. Evelyn is already on it, I told him. 4 days later, I was on a flight to Seattle, but before that, I had to return to the brownstone. Evelyn had secured a court-ordered asset freeze, and she arranged for 2 Boston police officers to escort me inside to retrieve my archives and clothing. Julian was standing in the foyer when I walked in. He didn't look angry. He looked at me with the cold, dead calculation of a man running a risk assessment. He didn't say a single word. His mother, Beatrice, was sitting on the velvet sofa. Beatrice was a terrifyingly petite woman who wielded Southern hospitality like a switchblade. She had despised me since the day Julian introduced us, though she always masked it behind thin compliments and fake concern. Now, she just watched me pack my life into cardboard boxes, her eyes tracking my every move.
The way Beatrice inquired about my archival work, with that poisonous, exaggerated surprise that I actually held a paying job, the way she always deferred to Julian's recounting of our vacations, subtly erasing my presence from our own lives. I had always known she was the architect of his ambition. Julian wasn't an idiot, but he lacked imagination. He needed a woman to draw the blueprints for his cruelty, and Beatrice had been drafting his life since he was born. As I carried my final box of files toward the front door, she spoke. Her voice was terrifyingly pleasant, like a neighbor recommending a dry cleaner. "You are making a catastrophic mistake, Nora." I didn't stop walking. I didn't turn around. I just hauled the box out into the freezing air and didn't look back. The following Thursday, I was sitting in Marcus Thorne's Seattle office. It occupied the penthouse of a steel and glass tower, boasting panoramic views of the Puget Sound. His paralegal offered me sparkling water and the kind of hushed, deferential respect reserved exclusively for people who suddenly possess generational wealth. The legal gauntlet took 5 exhausting hours. Identity confirmation, fingerprinting, sworn affidavits regarding my marital status, and a brutal review of my divorce decree from Arthur. Marcus was meticulous. The $82 million wouldn't arrive in one lump sum. I would receive an initial tranche of $12 million within 3 weeks, with the remainder dripping out over 2 years as Arthur's complex stock portfolios were systematically liquidated. I flew back to Boston on a red-eye Friday night. On Saturday morning, while I was boiling water for tea, my burner phone buzzed. Unknown caller. I answered. A man with a raspy, deliberately casual voice spoke. "Nora, I'm a buddy of Julian's. Just calling to give you a heads up. People who pull the kind of stunts you're pulling, well, they usually find their professional lives get very complicated. You're an archivist. That requires security clearances for rare documents, right? Clearances can be revoked if someone files a complaint about theft. He let the threat hang in the air for 3 agonizing seconds. Might want to reconsider how hard you're pushing this divorce. I stood in the tiny, cramped kitchen of my friend Maya's apartment. Maya had let me crash on her futon. I stared at the peeling paint on the wall and realized I wasn't shaking. I wasn't terrified. I was furious. "I am recording this call," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "State your name for the record." Click. He hung up. I immediately called Evelyn. Then I called Marcus in Seattle. Both lawyers gave me the exact same lethal diagnosis: a third-party threat against my professional livelihood, executed via phone during active litigation, was a nuclear-level legal error on Julian's part. Because I received the call on my cell phone, the telecom carrier automatically logged the metadata. By Monday morning, Evelyn had filed a blistering motion for a protective order and harassment injunction. Tuesday afternoon, Julian's lawyer called Evelyn, suddenly desperate to discuss an amicable out-of-court resolution. Evelyn called me right after hanging up with him. I could practically hear her grinning through the speaker. "They thought you'd be crying in a motel room, begging for your health insurance back," she said. "They had absolutely no idea you were already armed to the teeth." "They're going to pivot," I told her, staring out Maya's window at the Boston slush. "Let them," Evelyn replied. "You sleep, eat something green. You need to hoard your stamina for the actual war." I listened to her. For 3 days, I did absolutely nothing productive. I walked around the public garden in the freezing mornings. I bought overpriced pho from the place down the street. I read a biography of Catherine the Great that I'd ignored for a year. Most importantly, I let my body do the quiet, terrifying work of building a human spine. Wednesday was my first appointment with a new OB/GYN, fully covered by the independent health insurance plan Evelyn had bullied into existence for me. The ultrasound tech found the heartbeat immediately, strong, fast, perfectly normal. I sat in my Civic in the clinic parking lot afterward, gripping the steering wheel, and felt something foreign settle in my chest. Absolute peace. It was fleeting, but it was real. The counterattack came 10 days later. Julian's attorney, a slick corporate litigator named Harrison Vance, no relation, sent a heavily worded settlement proposal. It was a masterpiece of transparent desperation. Julian offered an uncontested divorce. He offered to lift the freeze on the joint accounts. And, using the word generously, he offered to waive any future claims to my separate Seattle inheritance. In return, I had to drop the harassment injunction, accept a pathetic 30% of our marital assets, and sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement explicitly barring me from discussing the timeline of our separation with anyone ever. I read the PDF twice on Maya's futon. I called Evelyn. "She's trying to buy a gag order," she said before I even asked. "The NDA is the only thing he actually wants. He knows the timeline proves he was hunting Arthur's estate before the eviction. If that hits the public divorce docket, his high-end clientele will drop him overnight. Rich men don't trust brokers who orchestrate financial ambushes on pregnant wives. Plus, the financial offer is insulting. Given the duration of your marriage and his illegal asset dissipation, a judge would award you significantly more than 30%. So we tell him to go to hell." "We tell him to go to hell," I agreed. "And we don't offer a counter-proposal. We let him bleed." That's exactly what we did. I won't lie and say the offer didn't tempt me for a fleeting second. There is a version of me, exhausted, nauseous, sleeping on a lumpy futon, who looked at that document and thought, what if I just sign it? What if I take the gag order, grab my archives, and vanish into my $80 million? I entertained that cowardly fantasy for about an hour while the snow battered Maya's windows, and then I killed it. because this wasn't just about Julian protecting his career, it was about Julian protecting Beatrice. Julian was a broker, he flipped assets, but the meticulous, paranoid research required to track Arthur's sealed trust, that required obsessive patience. That required someone with endless free time and a vested interest in my destruction. It required the woman who sat perfectly still on my velvet sofa, watching me pack my life away. I pulled up my burner email and drafted a message to Clara, Arthur's sister. I asked her one very specific, delicate question. Did anyone contact you or Arthur's former colleagues in the months after he died, asking probing questions about his estate? Clara replied 3 hours later. Now that you mention it, yes. In late November, a woman called my office. She claimed to be a freelance writer doing a piece on biotech wealth transfers. She asked very specific questions about whether Arthur left his fortune to charity or family. I blew her off. But Nora, she called from a Boston area code. That was the smoking gun. Maya had been my anchor since our undergrad days. We met in a dusty library basement arguing over the historical accuracy of a documentary, and we shared a mutual hatred of cheap wine and fake people. Maya was fiercely pragmatic. When I showed up on her doorstep at 2 in the morning, she just unlocked the deadbolt, pointed to the futon, and said, "Stay until you win." That night, she came home from the university, dumped her grading on the counter, and found me buried under legal printouts. She ordered Thai food, poured herself a massive glass of Cabernet, and looked at me. "Give me the update." I laid it all out. The $82 million, the pathetic settlement offer, the mob-style threat against my archivist credentials, and finally, Clara's email confirming that a woman from Boston had been hunting for Arthur's money months before Julian threw me out. Maya ate a forkful of pad thai, completely unfazed. "So, the mother-in-law dug up the inheritance," she said, pointing her fork at me, "and their genius plan was to dump you before the money vested, assuming that would sever any legal claim you had to the marital assets. Except they didn't realize Arthur named you directly in a blind trust, making their entire timeline irrelevant anyway." "Exactly," I said, taking a sip of ice water. "They played a brutal game, and they fundamentally misunderstood the rules." Maya smiled. It was a terrifying, beautiful smile. "So, how do we ruin them?" she asked. "I think they just assumed Arthur left you a token amount, or that it all went to his sister," Maya said, stabbing a piece of chicken with her fork. "They had no idea it was an $82 million nuclear bomb. When they figured out the scale of it, they panicked." "Exactly. And then I got pregnant. That completely derailed Julian's carefully planned exit timeline. He made a hasty, stupid decision to execute the eviction immediately rather than wait." Maya chewed thoughtfully, staring at the legal documents scattered across her table. "What do you need me to do?" "I might need you on the witness stand," I told her. "I need someone who can legally swear to my exact physical and financial state the night I showed up here. The timeline is the entire case." Maya didn't even blink. Done. I looked at her sitting across the small, cluttered kitchen table. Outside, the harsh Boston sleet had softened into a quiet, rhythmic rain. A city at night has a specific amber glow that feels unusually kind when you haven't slept properly in 3 weeks. I soaked in that dim, yellow light. "Thank you," I whispered. Maya waved her fork at me dismissively. "Save the thank yous for the victory dinner." Somewhere on the other side of the city, in that sprawling brownstone, Julian and Beatrice were undoubtedly plotting their next countermeasure. I knew they wouldn't just send another sterile legal letter. They were going to try something personal. I was right. They deployed Beatrice on a Sunday. She came alone. That was my first clue it was a psychological tactic. She called Maya's cell phone at 10 in the morning, a number I absolutely had not given her, which meant Julian had paid someone to dig it up. She asked if she could drop by to just talk. She actually used the word please, a word I had never once heard her direct at me in 5 years. I debated hanging up. Then I said yes. Refusing to see her gave me zero leverage. Letting her talk gave me ammunition. She arrived exactly at 11, carrying a tin of handmade lemon biscotti. The baked goods were so precisely weaponized to project maternal harmlessness that I almost laughed out loud. She stepped into Maya's cramped living room, politely declined a glass of water, and scanned the worn furniture with the distinct expression of an appraiser cataloging cheap junk. "I came to apologize, Nora," she began, sitting gracefully on the edge of the futon. I sat in the armchair opposite her and let the silence stretch. "He simply panicked, Nora," she continued, her voice dripping with practiced empathy. "The brokerage has been under severe market stress. When you dropped the pregnancy news, he just snapped. He knows it was unforgivable. He's absolutely sick with regret." She leaned forward, clasping her perfectly manicured hands. "Nora, this doesn't have to end in a courtroom." "You two have a history," Beatrice said softly, "and now a child." She let the word hang in the air, thick and heavy. "A baby needs a father, a real, intact family. I am begging you to think about the psychological damage you are doing to my grandchild by dragging Julian through a public crucifixion." There it was, clean, quiet, and aimed straight at the jugular. "And the inheritance?" I asked. The pause was microscopic. If I hadn't been staring directly at her pupils, I would have missed the slight flinch. "That is a private, unrelated matter," Beatrice said, her tone suddenly as smooth as glass. "It has nothing to do with saving your marriage." "Beatrice," I said, leaning forward so we were eye to eye, "who made the phone call to Clara Pendleton last November pretending to be a freelance biotech reporter?" A shadow passed over her face, controlled, instantly erased. "I have no idea what you are talking about." She immediately reset her posture, turning the warmth back up. "Nora, I am pleading with you as a mother. Stop this. Julian is willing to wipe the slate clean. He will attend any counseling you want. All he asks is that you drop the injunction and keep this secondary financial matter out of the divorce filings. The optics are destroying his business." "He wants me to drop the lawsuit," I translated, "and sign a gag order. He wants his human shield back." I stared at this 70-year-old woman and her stupid tin of biscotti. She had spent her entire life using politeness as a bludgeon, controlling every room by being the most reasonable person in it. "Beatrice," I said, my voice dropping to a dead calm, "I have the time-stamped logs of the drained bank accounts. I know Julian ran background checks on Arthur's estate. I know about the call you made to Clara. My lawyer knows about the call. A judge already slapped Julian with an asset dissipation ruling." I stood up. "Tell your son the answer is no. It was always no. And tell him that if either of you ever contacts my friends, my legal team, or my doctors again, Evelyn will file for a permanent restraining order before the ink dries." Beatrice's maternal warmth vanished. It was like watching a television get unplugged. The face beneath the mask was dry, rigid, and brutally calculating. "You are making a very powerful enemy," she whispered. "I already have one. I just prefer looking at her without the fake smile." She stood smoothly, picked up her tin of biscotti, and walked to the door. Before turning the knob, she looked back over her shoulder. "That wasn't a threat, Nora. It was a promise. You have absolutely no concept of who you are dealing with." She walked out. The door clicked shut. I stood in the middle of Maya's living room and noticed my knees were vibrating. My shaking wasn't from terror. It was the biological crash of sustained adrenaline. Your body eventually has to physically expel the panic you force your face to hide. I was afraid. Lying about that would be ridiculous. Beatrice wasn't a woman who threw around empty warnings. She had deep pockets, country club connections, and 70 years of practice breaking people down. She had raised Julian, which meant she spent her life studying how to locate a person's softest nerve and sever it. But the fear didn't make me want to hide. It made me want to burn their house to the ground. I remembered a fundamental rule from my archival training. History only erases the people who forget to leave a paper trail. I was building a paper trail made of titanium. I pulled out my phone and called Evelyn. "Beatrice just ambushed me," I told her. I recorded the entire conversation. Massachusetts requires two-party consent for phone calls, but an in-person conversation in a private residence where the guest has no reasonable expectation of privacy is a glorious legal gray area Evelyn loved to exploit. Evelyn listened to the audio file and let out a sharp, genuine laugh. "Flawless," she said. Next, I called Marcus in Seattle. He confirmed the first $12 million transfer from Arthur's blind trust had officially cleared the escrow account. The money was mine. I sat at Maya's kitchen table, opened my legal ledger, and wrote one sentence in heavy black ink. "They are terrified. Use it." The deposition happened on a freezing Tuesday in late March of 2014. Evelyn had ruthlessly filed for discovery a month prior, demanding Julian's financial records, internal server logs, and phone histories going back 2 full years. Harrison Vance, Julian's slick attorney, tried to quash every single subpoena. The judge tossed his objections out the window. The resulting paper trail was staggeringly precise. Julian had run his first search on Arthur Pendleton in May of the previous year. The search history was pulled directly from his brokerage firm laptop. He had visited a biotech financial aggregator, Arthur's defunct LinkedIn, and the homepage of Marcus Thorne's Seattle law firm. Beatrice's phone records revealed a 12-minute outbound call to Clara Pendleton's office in November, the exact call Clara had warned me about. The logs also showed 19 frantic calls between Julian and his mother in the 48 hours before my eviction. But the kill shot was an email. Julian had used his private encrypted email to message Harrison Vance 3 days before the pregnancy test. It read, "Need a mechanism to sever the marital knot before the Seattle lawyers locate N. Expedite." He had known everything. He orchestrated the entire cheating accusation purely to execute the eviction. We sat in Evelyn's glass-walled conference room. Julian sat across from me, wearing a bespoke navy suit, looking wooden and aggressively coached. The first hour was a mind-numbing parade of "I do not recall." Then Evelyn pulled out the email. She had printed the email in large font on thick cardstock. She slid it across the mahogany table silently, the way a poker player lays down a royal flush. Julian stared at the paper. His jaw tightened. A microscopic shift, but after 5 years of marriage, I knew how to read his micro-expressions. He was internally bleeding out. "Mr. Vance," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with polite venom, "do you recognize this correspondence?" "It appears to be an email," Julian muttered. "Did you draft it?" "I might have." "The text references Seattle lawyers locating N. Who is N?" Harrison Vance immediately objected. Evelyn didn't even blink. "Let me rephrase. Mr. Vance, prior to November 12th, were you aware that your wife was the primary beneficiary of Arthur Pendleton's $82 million trust?" Absolute silence. I counted 5 full seconds in my head. I had heard rumors suggesting, "A simple yes or no, Mr. Vance," Evelyn snapped. Harrison put a warning hand on Julian's forearm. Julian swallowed hard. I declined to answer, invoking my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. Evelyn smiled. It was a terrifying sight. Noted for the official record. Julian looked at Harrison. A silent, frantic conversation happened entirely in their eyes. I watched my husband realize in real time that his bulletproof plan had completely shattered. It wasn't a loud explosion. It was the quiet, sickening crunch of the foundation caving in. He looked at me. I thought I would feel vindicated, or furious, or heartbroken. Instead, I felt absolutely nothing. I held his gaze without blinking. He looked at the table first. Riding the elevator down to the lobby, Evelyn adjusted her briefcase. "He will surrender before this ever sees a courtroom," she stated. "I know," I replied. The elevator doors slid open to a surprisingly sunny Boston afternoon. The brutal winter was finally breaking. "How are you holding up, Nora?" Evelyn dropping her shark persona for 3 seconds. My lower back throbbed. I was chronically exhausted. I missed sleeping in my own bed, but for the first time in months, the crushing weight on my chest was gone. "I'm good," I said. "Actually, I'm bulletproof." Julian capitulated 9 days later. He had 0 leverage left. The final settlement agreement was 28 pages of total surrender. Julian permanently waived all future claims to Arthur's estate, legally classifying it as separate property. He was forced to repay the stolen $40,000 with interest. I secured 65% of our shared marital assets, including the forced sale of the brownstone and equity in his vintage car brokerage. Because the judge found glaring evidence of bad faith and financial abuse, the NDA was thrown in the garbage. I didn't sign a single clause limiting my speech. Furthermore, a court-ordered prenatal DNA test at 14 weeks legally established Julian as the biological father. It was written in permanent ink in the court docket. He was a liar from day one. I hope the reality of that printed page choked him. The first $12 million from Seattle dropped into my newly secured accounts on a rainy Wednesday in April. I was sitting on Maya's futon when the bank notification popped up. I just stared at the impossible string of zeros. I texted Maya. "The wire cleared." She replied instantly with 5 rocket emojis and the word Vance. I called Clara Pendleton that afternoon to tell her the legal bloodbath was over. She let out a long sigh. "Arthur would have loved watching you win this," she told me. Julian signed the final divorce decree on a Thursday. We were in separate rooms. I never saw his face. The marriage officially ceased to exist. Driving my Civic back to the apartment, the baby kicked for the very first time. It wasn't a flutter, it was a sharp, distinct knock against my ribs. "I'm in here," she was saying, using the only language she had. "I know," I whispered back, placing my hand over my stomach. "So am I." My daughter's name is Leela. She was born on a blistering Tuesday in July. 8 pounds, furious at the world, with Julian's dark hair and my relentless refusal to compromise. She is 9 months old now. Currently, she is aggressively trying to eat a board bart in her playpen. We don't live in Boston anymore. I bought a sprawling, light-filled Victorian house in Salem. I have my own independent archival consulting firm now. My name is etched on the brass plaque by the door. That reality still knocks the wind out of me sometimes. Arthur's money completely rewrote the boundaries of my life, but I fight every day to ensure it doesn't rewrite my character. I still spend hours buried in dusty blueprints. I still drink cheap diner coffee. Julian's brokerage took a massive hit after the settlement forced him to liquidate his inventory. He exercises his court-ordered visitation with Leela without starting fights. He is her father. That is a biological fact I cannot change. I try, usually failing, to separate the man who betrayed me from the man who plays blocks with my daughter. I haven't seen Beatrice since the day she brought the biscotti. Maya got married in October. I stood at the altar next to her while Leela screamed through the entire ceremony. Maya threatens to bring an air horn to my next wedding as payback. Clara flew out to visit us in the spring. She brought a manila folder filled with photos of Arthur from the years we were apart. Arthur standing on a ferry in Puget Sound, Arthur laughing in a lab coat. He always told me you were the only person who never lied to him, Clara said. I stared at a photo of my first husband, a man who saved my life a decade after we parted. I tried, I said. I spend my mornings sitting on the wraparound porch of the Salem house, drinking tea and dissecting the chain reaction that brought me here. A freezing night in February, a grocery store parking lot, a mahogany conference room. While I was living it, it didn't feel like a story of triumph. It felt like standing inside a burning building, desperately trying to find a door. But I found the door. When Leela is old enough to understand, I will hand her the archival box containing every legal document, every court transcript, and every bank statement. I won't show it to her as a warning. I will show it to her as an instruction manual. The people who try to break you down, the ones who calculate your destruction, are always betting on one specific thing. They bet that you don't realize how much power you actually hold. Julian bet on my shock. Beatrice bet on my isolation. They both lost. Know your worth. Leave a paper trail. Find a friend like Maya who will hand you a key at 2 a.m, and never, under any circumstances, sign away your voice. What would you have done if you were locked out in the cold that February night? Drop it in the chat. If my survival meant something to you, share this feed. Someone out there is sitting in the dark right now, needing to hear that the sun still comes up. Thanks for hanging out with me tonight.